I've not before reviewed a Suntup Editions book on this channel, but we're starting with a bang. This is their 2022 edition of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Roald Dahl. It was issued in a total limitation of 1,636 copies across 4 states, and I'll put the details of those up on the screen. Each state had its own quite distinctive design, whether it be the artist's edition, which had a dust jacket printed to look like a chocolate bar wrapper, or the lettered state, which had an enclosure designed to look like the gates of Willy Wonka's factory. But here, Paul Suntup has provided on loan a review copy of the ultra-rare Roman numeral edition, limited to only 10 copies, and as we see, it comes in this enclosure, this box, which is designed to look like a traditional box of chocolates. So we have this nice pink lid. It's covered in a leather with a visible grain, but it feels like a fine, smooth leather. It's quite nice to handle. And then the bottom part of the box is similarly covered in leather, this time in this turquoise colour. And we have this sliver of appropriately chocolate brown leather between the two. The front of the box is tooled in gilt with this frame, and then we have inlaid brown, green and red leathers, and it's also blocked in gilt with the title, the author's name, and we have here Suntup Editions. So quite a striking and unusual presentation box. It's a 2-part box, so we can lift the lid off. If we flip that round, we see that the inside of the lid is lined in this brown suede. And then we put the lid aside, and inside we are immediately confronted with the book itself. We have this yellow ribbon pull in order to lift the book out. So let me do that. And I will put the book aside for one moment. And then we see inside that this mechanism is that the ribbon pull is connected to this panel, also covered in brown suede. And it's that panel that lifts the book out of the box. Underneath we have this canary yellow paper. So the box feels, by the way, very solid and well made, feels quite substantial in the hand, and as I said, it's covered in this quite nice leather. Now we come on to the book proper, and I think this binding is quite special. So it's a full leather binding, just like the box that the book came in. It's clearly a very fine leather. It's a goatskin leather. It has a visible grain, but I wasn't able to spot any flaws in the leather at all. It feels very solid and also nice and tactile to handle. Inlaid into the front board here, we have, in a lighter shade, this meandering river of chocolate, just like the river that features in Willy Wonka's factory. And this leather has been cut and inlaid by hand, and everything fits together quite flawlessly. And then we have blocked in gilt this design, which clearly reflects some sort of confectionery. The tooling was done using specially made tools, apparently, and they in turn have been onlaid with green and red leathers. The whole design stretches around onto the backboard, so it's a wraparound design. We can see the whole thing there. And we see here on the spine that besides that design, we have 2 raised bands, and then we have blocked in gilt the author's name, the title, and Suntup Editions. All of the gilt tooling that you see here on the cover is 24 karat gold. All 3 edges of the text block have been gilded likewise in 24 karat gold. Additionally, I should say that the end bands have been hand sewn. I think this is quite an impressive binding. It is obviously in its own way quite understated, but I think that gives it a classical elegance, which I quite appreciate. But at the same time, it feels exceptionally well made, and it clearly has a lot of design thought and personality going into it. And the thing it reminds me of the most is these so-called designer bindings that collectors sometimes have made for their most treasured editions. And I think that's a great testament to the work of Shepherd, Sangorski and Sutcliffe, who executed the binding of this edition. Now let's open the book up. We arrive at the end papers. They are printed on that canary yellow paper that we saw also inside of the box, and they have been printed with this design that again clearly represents chocolate and confectionery more generally. Unlike many books where the end papers would span across the recto and verso sides and form the hinge of the book, here the hinge is in leather to give it some extra strength, and then we have separate sheets for the paste down and free end paper, and the paste down here is surrounded by these tooled gilt elements. The paper of the edition is called Reeves Heavyweight Mould Made, and this is, as the name implies, quite a heavyweight paper. It has an off-white coloration, and most importantly to me, it has this slightly fuzzy felt-like texture to it that makes it really a tactile pleasure to handle. So a very nice paper for this edition, I think. And then we arrive at the title page, and there are a couple of things to remark on here. So firstly, the book was printed letterpress by Bradley Hutchinson on a Heidelberg cylinder press. And so we see the first example of the letterpress printing here on the recto side. Here on the verso leaf, we see our first illustration, which is by Quentin Blake. So these illustrations were initially made by Blake in the 1990s for trade editions of Dahl's books. And I think in the intervening 30 years or so, they've become synonymous with Dahl's work. So in a way, I think it's quite fitting that they've been included in this edition. One thing I would say is that although the illustrations have been printed offset, the paper on which they're printed is very sympathetic to them. It shows the colours very nicely, but also the slight off-white colouring and the slight texture of the paper somehow helps to make the illustrations feel like they're an integral part of the design of the book rather than just printed on as an afterthought. So I thought the reproduction of the illustrations was quite nice. Another thing we see here on the title page is that we have two colour printing, so we have black and then this russet colour, and that is a feature that will be present throughout the book. Now we turn into the book, we have the table of contents. The book includes an introduction, which is by Donald Sturrock, who was a biographer of Roald Dahl, and therefore is pretty well qualified, I think, to write this introduction. And I think the introduction is especially interesting if, like me, you're not that familiar with Roald Dahl's backstory, because it gives some pretty interesting context to the book in terms of what was going on in Roald Dahl's life at the time. We see here, and again it will be repeated throughout the book, we have these raised caps. All of the display text in the book is set in Coq Antica, while the body text is set in a face by Bruce Rogers called Centaur, which is one of my all-time favourite typefaces. Here we see an example of the typographic layout of the introduction, and if we skip ahead by a few pages, we can see what the typographic plan for the book itself looks like. Now let me leaf through and we'll take a look at some of these illustrations by Quentin Blake. Let me remark first of all that this novel spans 150 pages or thereabouts, and we seem to have an illustration at least every 2 or 3 spreads, and if one does some rudimentary arithmetic, that works out to around 70 illustrations or so. Therefore, this is a very liberally illustrated book, very generously illustrated. Some of the illustrations will be very small vignettes like this, but there are also plenty of more substantial character portraits as we leaf through the book. Perhaps I should pause here also to give us an opportunity to look at the typographic layout for chapter headers. So as I said, We have a raised cap here. We have two-colour printing with this little ornament that sits below the chapter title, which is set in that display face cock antico. Here's the end of the story. So as I said, about 150 pages. But then we go into a section of the book dedicated to bonus content. And there's quite a rich collection of material in here. So we have some deleted chapters from the book that come from early drafts. We have example reproductions of manuscripts in Roald Dahl's hand. We have examples of typed manuscripts. This is one feature I enjoyed quite a lot. So here we have side-by-side comparisons of illustrations by 4 artists who have produced images for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And so we can see a comparison of the different styles. And although they do indeed differ quite substantially, we nevertheless see the same scenes are very recognisably covered by each of the 4 artists. And that was quite an interesting comparison to make. I think it's a testament to the vividness of Dahl's writing that when 4 illustrators independently sit down to illustrate the same scene from his book, we get 4 images that are so recognisably similar in content, if not in style. Here are some personal photographs from Dahl's archive. And then as a fun final inclusion, we have a reproduction of a letter sent by Roald Dahl in reply to Paul Suntup in his youth. And perhaps this was part of the inspiration that ultimately led Paul Suntup to get into the publishing business himself. As usual, the book ends with a colophon page. It has some production details, more illustrations by Quentin Blake. Ordinarily, of course, it would be numbered, but this is a review copy, so it's unnumbered. And then it is signed by the introducer, Donald Sturrock, and by Paul Suntup himself. Here are the rear end papers. They're just like the front end papers, except that we see here now that the binders stamped their name on the leather. That is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory by Suntup Editions in its really quite rare Roman numeral state. Although out of print, this was at the time, of course, quite an expensive book at $14,500, but I think some credit is due to Suntup, because that was not used as an excuse to degrade the quality of the other states in an unreasonable way. So all 4 states had their own quite individual and interesting binding design. All 4 included the same substantive content of the introduction, of course the text, the illustrations, and that special bonus content at the end of the book. The top 3 states were all printed letterpress, and the top 2 states used the same Reeves heavyweight mold-made paper, that paper that I liked so much. So the thing that really sets this Roman numeral state apart is the binding, both in that leather presentation box that we saw at the beginning of the video, but especially in the binding of the volume itself. This has been superbly executed by Sangorski and Sutcliffe. It feels very well made. It's beautiful in the hands. It's a great tactile experience. I think the spine in particular is especially handsome. It has this elegant blocking of the text. We see the tooling wrapping around onto the spine. 2 bands. This is going to look very handsome on somebody's bookcase if they can bear to put that presentation box aside. So that is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in its Roman numeral state from Suntup Editions, a very nice example of fine press publishing from that press.